Hello and welcome to today's dialogue. Today we're going to be talking about some new insights and ideas that have come through. I'm experiencing a wave of energy, and sometimes when that happens, a bunch of insights come into my mind and I tend to write them down. And I have a lot piled up from over the years, but right now I feel like talking about the most recent ones that came through today and going from there. And I found the flavor of these insights to be new for me. They felt really new for me, and just wondering if they feel new for you, like something that you've never heard before, something that's never occurred to you before, or perhaps in this exact way. And some of them seem to lean into this feeling of higher consciousness, or maybe even something that might be called enlightened or enlightenment. And I assure you, I by no means think that I'm enlightened. But I do know these words came into my mind and I wrote them down. That's kind of all that I know. And so by sharing, we may learn something together. And it doesn't matter if you have a diagnosis of bipolar or not. And these dialogues aren't about the illness part of bipolar. There's so much more to it. And that's what talking about these insights is about, is going into some of that which comes through that isn't about bipolar at all. But bipolar was a crack in my system that allowed other thoughts and ideas to come into my mind other than what I normally thought about before. So this is not medical advice. It's not advice at all. It's perhaps a mimetical voice of context. And another reason I'm talking to myself, or I'm not really talking to myself, I'm talking with these insights and ideas. So that's where the dialogue comes from. Not only that, I didn't think of these ideas. They arose in my mind, so I don't consider them my ideas or my insights. So in that way, I'm having a dialogue with them, because when I share the insight or say the insight and then kind of add more to it or extrapolate, that's where the dialogue part comes in, is the extrapolation. And by engaging with the insights and ideas and memes in dialogue, that's going to re-encode the insight in my brain or wherever it goes in a different way than if I just write it down. Sometimes too, when I'm in this energy that feels a bit higher, I will call it, but I don't feel higher myself, but this information coming through is a sign that my mind is in an open state. But sometimes things come through about the process of how the ideas and insights themselves come through. So I'll give you an example, and this might sound kind of strange, but I wrote, I speak as the memes, as a decentralized voice. It changes daily. Like I'm not sure what will happen to be my particular embodiment. I'm not sure what will happen to be my particular embodiment. So though that came through earlier today, that might not be my perspective tomorrow or the next day. Perhaps that was the perspective of whatever was coming through at that time. And when I say coming through or arising in my mind, if you look up other ways of knowing, you might come upon some of the ways that we can know without really knowing how we know. And part of what I'm learning is trying to figure out how I know what I don't know, or how I know what I don't know how I know, I should say. Like, what is that process? Can it be propriocepted? And I think it can, because the insights that are coming through are subtle. They're subtleties about subtleties. So some of them are about the subtleties of thought, and I'm not sure what the other ones are about, but looking into the process of knowing but not knowing how we know. Imagine one day there's that knowing that generally arises through a process that we don't know how we know. But imagine if we figure out how that works. Well, then we know, but we know how we know, right? But that way of knowing and knowing how we know is completely different from the way by which we currently know and know how we know, which is generally through thought, through thinking, through the memories in our brain, through seeing something and reading it and recognizing it through thought. And that's a completely valid and needed process, but there's other ways of knowing. And it might not even be knowing as we now know it. We might not call it knowing. And with this other way of knowing that might not be knowing, we may get to a point where we say no to knowing in the ways we used to know. And that's sort of what we're going into. And if you're somebody who doesn't have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, listening to this is a way to test out the possibility of learning something from somebody who has a bipolar diagnosis. And I don't mean learn about their story or their pathography, their story of illness, or what they know about bipolar and what they've been told about it through the medical paradigm. That's all part of it. But I'm saying that aside, what is it that people who have a different kind of perception that we at this moment in time call bipolar, what is it that they see? What is it that they learn? What is it that they know? What insights and ideas do they have? And generally, ideas are shared in a state where it's very energetic, a so-called mania, and it is hard to listen and process maybe in those moments. But in a dialogue, sharing some of that and some of it that has come through 14 years in after doing a super intentional process of engaging with the insights and ideas. So I recommend listening with openness and curiosity, with the right brain, if you will. Not for, is this a fact? Is this right or wrong? Is this proven by science? Is this bad or good? In a way, some of this is what I call science fantasia. So there's science fiction, there's science, of course, but there's also science fantasia where, and I don't know if that's the right term, but we can see with eyes. We can see with hypothesize. Our eyes can hypothesize when we look through questioning. And dialogue is part of questioning. To go with that, I definitely question everything that comes through, or I question everything that I'm going to say, meaning I hold it with a lot of uncertainty to the point where I don't hold it at all. If I didn't write these insights down, they would just disappear from whence they came. So it's only through this intentional process of receiving them and honoring them in a sense and writing them down that I'm able to go into them now. And it's that space of uncertainty, of not knowing, is how they come through to my mind. And that's not something that I'm in control of per se. I've definitely honed it over the years. I can tell you that I didn't have really any insights coming through for the last month or so, and now they're back. So I'm writing them down and I'm going to talk about them. Not only is it dialogue to engage with what is written down, it's also encoded differently when you speak them out loud. So if there is something you hear that is interesting, you could for fun write it down and look at it and say it out loud, or say what you see from the insight out loud and riff off of it in your own way. Because like I said, these aren't my insights. Sure, they're influenced by my journey through engaging and building a relationship with the process of receiving insights itself. I see them as thoughts that anyone could think if they see what I saw. I don't think that's right, because they're not thoughts that you think. I don't know what they are. I think they come out of nothingness. And we might think, well, why does any of it matter? Why does it matter? Why talk about any of this? But that type of perspective is the perspective that blocks this type of thing from opening up. This type of perception, this type of seeing nuance and subtlety. As soon as we think, well, what's the valid reason? Uncertainty is beyond reason, right? It's not above or below, but it's beyond. When you see something uncertain, you can use reason. But if reason comes in and says, tell me the reason why to look this way, tell me the reason not to know, tell me the reason to stop reason, to stop reasoning, to stop the process of knowing. That's a trap. It might not be a trap. There might be a way to reason with reason, but it's not the dialogue that I'm going to go into now. I'm not going into reasoning with reason. I'm going into the insights of the season. Okay, so these insights are going to make more sense if I share a bit of the backstory for a few minutes. I was just looking at them and I could tell that without this part, they don't really hold together very well. So when I'm in this open state where I have a tendency to have these insights, and I call them insights because they're something I'd never thought of before. They're not coming from the stream of thought. They're of a different quality. They come in a flash, and then I write them down. Recently, I realized that I sort of disconnected from the idea of spirituality quite a long time ago. 15 to 20 years ago, I would consider that I was a spiritual seeker of sorts. And then I got diagnosed bipolar, and that first crisis felt really spiritual. And over the years, slowly, I found myself framing experiences as meaning rather than spiritual. And one of the reasons is because we can think of the dichotomy between, say, spirituality and material existence, and they seem to be separate from each other. And I came to understand that meaning was a unifying concept because the material world has meaning, and so does the spiritual world. And I can see meaning in the material world, and I can see meaning in things that are spiritual. That being said, spirituality has its definite boundaries and distinctions apart from the material world. And I felt like exploring spirituality a bit more because I had been disconnected from it for so long. And when I say exploring spirituality, what I really mean is just picking up one of the books on my shelf. I might have ordered this book on Amazon during one of my last energetic waves a couple years ago. This energetic wave, I am working on noticing the tendency to want to improve things, like get a different plastic for the shower curtain so I can see the outer shower curtain and things like that. So I'm purposefully not going into that type of direction because at this point I'm seeing if the energy won't bend in the direction of let's make my life just a little bit better. I've done a lot of that in the past. So what happened was I went away for a week and I was watering the plants and I was trying to put some extra water in them, more than I usually do. So then one of the plants that is on the top of where the books are, the top shelf, that is sort of mesh wire, it overflowed in that bottom part. And so it was pouring all over my books. And then I noticed and I cleaned it up. And then I dried out the books outside. And one of the books was the book that I'm reading now. And when I say what book it is, I'm just sharing it as this is what I'm reading. But I'm not trying to promote any type of spirituality. I just said that I haven't been spiritual in like 10 years, so I'm not trying to do that. It is by Dion Vimal, and it's called The Myth of Enlightenment. And I've been reading a little bit each morning, and since I have been doing that, that's when the energy started again. And Dion Vimal is an enlightened master. And I've read his teachings before, and sometimes I kind of understand what he's saying. Sometimes it doesn't resonate. But right now, reading just a bit is creating some insights. Sometimes I'll have insights just walking around and they'll come out of nowhere. But a lot of times they're sparked by something. So it's another subtle layer on what I'm reading or what that person is saying or what I'm watching. And if you think about how conversations happen, for example, somebody will say, "Hey, how are you?" And the other person says, "I'm fine." When I read these sentences, it's kind of like, "Hey, how are you?" And then the insight is the "I'm fine," right? So the reading is speaking to me in a sense, and there's a response in my mind. That's how I read sometimes. And when this happens, I have a tendency to not be able to read very much because it will just create a ton of insights. So I only read a page today. The last few days I've been writing several pages, and I started highlighting a bit, and now I'm full on writing in the margins. So part of the reason why I'm going this detailed into it is to share also how it happens, how it comes about, right? Like if I were just to sit here and just read all them one after the other energetically, that would be one thing. But to go into it step by step is another. It's kind of like if somebody has a YouTube video and they say, "Today I'm going to teach you how to do this with AI, step by step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going step by step into these insights. In a sense, because maybe I want to share how to have insights from reading or how to have insights from walking at the park. And what that is something new arising in one's mind. It's a surprising arising. Like how often is a thought surprising? Insights are always surprising. But when you get used to them, they don't have that surprise effect, but they're sensed as new. Thought is sensed as old in general. Insight is sensed as new. So with that said, because this book got wet from overflowing, watering the plants, here I am reading it. And another part of this newness is that when I read, I'm reading for insights. I'm not reading to memorize what's being said. And because of that, I'm not really sharing much of what's in this book. It's just going to be a little snippet out of context. So the little snippet out of context will be the prime of the insight, which is the context. The added context, which has nothing to do with what the original author was saying. So by reading it, my brain creates an extrapolation or an insight. An extrapolation is a little different from an insight, and this is related to what I was talking about, I think yesterday on a video, which is the wrong turn of thought. So here we're thinking about thought, as far as I understand, similar to how Eckhart Tolle talks about thought. You know, the thinker, the mind chatter, as well as with some overlap with how J. Krishnamurti talks about thought. That was one of the main topics J. Krishnamurti talked about. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert on J. Krishnamurti's teachings, nor Eckhart Tolle's teachings. I did read a lot of their writings back in the day, and I do still watch some Krishnamurti videos every now and then. And recently I've been listening to the series The Ending of Time, which is talking about the ending of psychological time. So I'm definitely being imbued with all of this, but at the same time, it's not by accident, because much of what I wonder about is related to this. In general, I wonder about how is my brain or being operating differently when I'm in a so-called normal state, and then how does it change and how is it operating when I'm in a more energetic state. So what are all the factors of that? And one of them is thought. So it's part of my study that I'm studying all the time, not just, I'm watching Ending of Time and I picked up this spiritual book. This is what I gravitate towards. And it seems like these subtle nuances gravitate towards me when I gravitate towards this. I sense that I'm trying to put words to the way that my mind and brain work in fluctuation and fluidity. I can sense that someone like me with a bipolar label, when I was initially diagnosed, I had what they call symptoms of pressured speech, neologisms, word salad, the technical terms and the non-technical terms. And now I can imagine that after 10 years of working with that movement of information and language and perception and action, being able to slow down enough through understanding the meaning, not in a large sense, like understanding the meaning of everything, but understanding the movement of meaning, moment to moment. I can then attempt to put words to that, right? In the beginning, I'd only be able to quickly say the words that are coming to me. Over time, I learned to instead write the words down. And then if I rewrite those words or extrapolate those words or build on those words or talk about those words, then I've engaged with all those words so much that not only can I understand those words and insights, I can understand the movement of the words and insights and have some level of modulation of them, or as it changes and fluxes, be able to embody whatever is needed to gather them or understand the next bunch of them. But then at the same time, there's a perception of making the structure behind that movement of that speed and information density and chaos at times of words. Now I can see that part too. And then when I see that, it takes a while to be able to understand it enough to be able to start to say what's happening, only by being able to slow it down. I'm not trying to slow it down. It's slowed down because I've worked with it so much that it's now at a regular speed, right? Like if I first learned to drive a car and the first time I press the gas pedal, if I'm going 30 kilometers, it's going to seem kind of fast for my abilities. Like I could easily lose control. But after I practice and after experience, I can go on the highway and feel just fine. So it's kind of like that, right? It's the same driver, it's just a different situation. So now when there's a highway of information coming through, me as the driver, that's no longer driving me, it's no longer pushing me. I'm the driver, right? And somebody who becomes a skilled driver, they can drive while they're talking about how they're driving, or they can drive while they're teaching someone else how to drive, or they can drive while they talk about all the parts of the car if they've studied that part as well. But it's a new thing to figure out how to do that. You know what it's like? The bipolar energy, it starts suddenly in a lot of cases. It did for me. It's like, imagine someone comes along and tells you, you're going to go to school. You're going to go and get a big education. And then I would say, oh great, like where do I register? And where do I buy my textbooks? And the person says, well, you're not going to register. It's just going to hit you all of a sudden. Like, you don't know when, any moment. And you are going to have to write your own textbooks. That's what it's like. And what I mean is, there's a lot of information that comes through. There's a lot of meaning. There's a lot of insights. There's a lot of ideas. There's ideas for innovation. There's so much that comes through that if I write it all down, which I pretty much have, I have my own textbooks to then go back and study the text of this extraordinary state, of this information opening, of this download, of this blueprint. It's like downloading a textbook. And that download continues, right? In my experience, with enough downloading and learning from the textbook, not just writing the textbook, but then going and adding more to the textbook later on. So the time to start to learn is once that extraordinary state is over. And in studying, what I do is I add more. So if it's just a little point like, don't listen to what I say, but from where I say it, then I can extrapolate that further, right? It might remind me of something I read by someone else. It might give me an idea. And the thing is that after a certain amount of skilled practice and study, and for some reason there's a spiritual word coming to mind, which I don't ever use, devotion, right? Devotion to your own textbook that you are writing and figuring it out and editing it. And in a sense, in my experience, that information that comes through is more interesting than any TV show, anything on YouTube. And what I was going to add is that after a while, you can teach. So you go to school, a school that happens suddenly, where you write your own textbooks, and you keep writing and you keep studying and you keep harvesting and you keep iterating until you can teach something, whatever it is that is yours to teach. It doesn't even have to be teaching. What I'm trying to say is that state is a teacher. There's some kind of teacher impelling us to write these insights and ideas down or share them. And we live in a world where we're not just randomly going around teaching people things. So we write them down. We keep engaging with that meaning in dialogue and extrapolating until we can share something. But there has to be enough studying from those iterations. It's like the iteration provides information, and there's too much information to encode it properly. So we write it down, and then we study and practice and harvest it in the time when we're not in a heightened state of awareness that is giving us too much information. That gives us the time to look at the information and engage with it through writing and speaking to ourselves and re-encode it in our life system that is us. And over time, eventually, we can speak. So, for example, now I'm talking, and I could probably talk for several hours in a row. And my speech isn't pressured. It's not word salad. For recording these, I do truncate the silences, and that's it. I'm not editing them other than that. So getting to this point is one of the reasons I'm doing these dialogues again. I did a bunch of dialogues in 2016 to 2019. And so 10 years later, I was talking with AI, and then it's not really working well because they did an update and it doesn't seem good, but it seems like there's energy towards doing the self-dialogue, partially just to see how much of this I can say through my voice. Years ago, when I did the self-dialogue for 3 years, I never had a backlog. I would write things down during the day or over a couple days, and then I would sit and talk about it until I was finished them all. But now, since I took time to do other things, I have a huge backlog. So we'll see how many insights I end up giving voice to, or if I'll be able to catch up to the backlog, or if just more will come through where I never get to the backlog. We'll see. I don't know. I wasn't planning to go into all of that background, but like I said, I think part of it that I'm seeing now and honoring now a little bit more than I was before is trying to say how I know these things. I don't know them. Know is the wrong word. It's trying to say my brain's not operating in that realm of knowledge. It still can, but when these insights come through, it's not that. I just imagine, and I don't say that this is true for everyone or anything like that, but somehow I'm seeing now that, like, if I could rewind to my very first mania, and I'm talking a lot, talking to strangers, I'm just imagining that somebody walks up beside me and says, you know, I know what you're going through. I went through this too. And how about I stay with you for the next week and I explain to people how it is that you're saying what you're saying and why you're saying these things. And that person is able to slow it down and say what I just said and maybe more, and in a better, more succinct way. I don't mean more words, but have more nuance to it. That would be really helpful for me to understand, and also for other people to understand too, right? But the thing is, we're all vulnerable and we wander around like that, and then people just eventually think it's an illness. But really, we need to iteratively, each episode of energy, write our own textbook and study it until we're to the point where we can speak what that energy wants to say. There's a lot of examples of that, and I can't think of one, but where a person is in a certain situation, they're out in public, and then someone's with them and they're like, that person who's with them is always explaining, you know, oh, this happened to them and they're going to get better soon, or blah, blah, right? It's kind of like that. But since it's invisible, there's no support for that. What it is kind of the ego is starting to lose its hold, right? I think that's a big part of it, because so much of what we say up until that point is directed by our ego or our self or our I perspective. And when that starts to have cracks, we're seeing and saying a lot of other things. Now, if we write down what we see and say in those states and study it when we're not in that open state, then next time that energy comes in, we'll be able to see and say a bit more coherently while the energy's there. And since we're engaging with it when we're not in that open state, we can access some of that perception, that type of perception and insight when we're not in that state. And so it slowly closes this gap between this huge energy wave with this openness, and everything is perceived so vastly, to eventually it's just sort of one and the same thing with maybe small vacillations. And I'm not saying that I'm at the end of that process. I might be still in the very early stages of it. I can imagine that if I was near the end of that process, I would be able to speak probably all day like this without truncating silences and without any notes, without any sticky notes, without any written stuff down. Because even now, all that stuff is in the past, right? They're on sticky notes. They're in the past. I wrote them down months ago or years ago. They're in the past, but I haven't said them, right? I wrote them down, but I haven't said them. So that's why I'm going to try to give voice to them, because, or at least I think I am, I don't know. There's something powerful about saying, I don't know. It's something I was saying to myself a lot before my mind opened up. I don't know. Additionally, I watched a video by Vsauce years ago, and he said something that really stuck with me. And some of these points over the years that I've watched people say really stick with me. And he said, I don't remember exactly, but it was something to the effect of, what will you be the first to say? He was saying something about, we can't say everything or whatever. He was basically asking, like, will you say anything new? Like, will you say anything so new that you're actually the first person to ever utter that combination of words? And that's why, for me, these insights are new for me. Maybe somebody else has already said them out loud. But if I have, say, I'll just guess, 10,000 insights written down, like, what if 10% of them are completely new? What if 1% are completely new? What if 0.0001% are completely new? I think a human saying something completely new, even just out loud to themselves, is something profound. And I think that's what we sense into in so-called mania, and that's why it's quite exciting. We're saying these things and we don't even know where they're coming from, and they're new. We don't know how we are saying them. They're called special messages because they feel special, because we know that thought isn't special. So if something's coming through other than thinking it or whatever, it seems special. But eventually, I don't want to go into this, but eventually we start to think that that means we're special, because we start to think that we're thinking them, right? That might be the conclusion we come to, because of course whatever's in our mind is something that we think. So we take ownership of it or identity of it. But we're not going to go there. But we are going to talk about thought, the ego. So these are insights into thought and the ego. And in a way, in order to see what thought and the ego and the self are doing, you need a different perspective other than thought. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, but this isn't that. This is insight looking at thinking, or I guess human eyes looking at something and having an insight to the thinking process. So I don't know what you would call that, but it's different. So I think we're finally going to get into the content here, or the context. So I'm going to share what I read and then the insight that came out of that. And hopefully with everything we've gone into so far, it will make more sense as to why I wrote that. And as I was saying before, this relates to a video I did about the wrong turn of thought. How thought is the wrong turn, or thought has taken a wrong turn. So this adds to that. So what I read was, we'll even walk away from it. Now, I don't even have to read the whole sentence, because this isn't about what this book says, though I do recommend reading it. It's fascinating. We'll even walk away from it. And what I saw was, the movement of the self is the walking away. The movement of the self is the walking away with words. So he was talking about, walking away from something. So you imagine a human being walking away in physical space. But since we were talking about the movement of thought taking a wrong turn yesterday, from the level of thought, which was related to light coming into the eye, and if it's coming into the eye through the veil of thought, it's going to bend the wrong way and literally turn to the wrong part of the brain and then create a thought. But it's only seeing a partial amount of that moment because of the veil of thought, the veil that thought puts before our eyes. So what I saw in addition by reading this here is that the movement of thoughts is a movement of words, right? Generally, it's a movement of words. Thinking something like, I want to walk away. But the thought saying the words to itself, I want to walk away, is one thing. But the movement of thought itself is words walking away, is words turning the wrong way. So the walking away with words is the self. The walking away with words creates the veil that is thought. Thought walks away from the moment with words. So the movement of words and thought is a turning away from the moment in perception. So thought walks perception away from seeing totally with words. Now you can see what I said just now two ways. Because of words, perception isn't total. There's a walking away with words from perception, and that walking away with words is thought. The other way to see it, you can say it the exact same way, and you can see it completely differently. The walking away from perception with words, or I should say walking away from perception with words. So if perception has an insight, if perception is total and has an insight, it walks away from the moment with words, but words based on the insight. So it's not even necessarily the walking away with words, it's the total perception or the partial perception of thought. So I didn't write that part down, but I see that now. It's not about the walking away with words, but it is in a way because thought walks the wrong way with words. And what I saw that I didn't put in the video yesterday, but I may as well add it here because we were talking about thought being the wrong turn, but it could be a right turn if it's shared. But I was seeing that the more thought walks away with words and walks away with words and goes in circles, that circular motion creates the center, that is the self. Whereas, if there's an insight and one walks away with those words and shares it or writes it down and sort of drops it and doesn't make a self out of it, then it doesn't create the self. So the next line, or the next bit, is just, they will fight it. They will fight it. And what I saw was the fighting it is the movement of the self. The movement of the self is the fighting it. And again, he's talking about human beings resisting something. But the movement of the self is the fighting it. The words are fighting themselves, and that prevents the development of insight. So what I'm seeing is at the level of words, right? The words themselves. So there's the walking away with words, which if repeated and identified with creates a self. And then there's the words are fighting themselves. So in that walking away, there's a fighting. And because of the walking away with words that we're talking about as the movement of generating the self, there's a fighting because what else can words do but fight if we're not actually fully seeing? So the words are generated by not seeing completely, seeing through the veil of thought. So of course there's got to be some kind of fight energy in there. So whether or not the words are like literally fighting against themselves, like though we do tend to have arguments with ourselves in our head, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying like even each letter of the words and in between the letters and the space and everything, all the energy around the words are fighting, right? So for this next one, and they'll all interrelate to some extent. This next one, I will share a little bit what he's saying. Since this book is about the myths of enlightenment, he's saying that you can't seek enlightenment. He's not the only one to say that. Like you can't try to get enlightened, though people do, right? The ego can't become enlightened. The trying the will of the ego can't create enlightenment. So he's saying that it's something that happens. And he shares a personal detail for himself. He says, the only thing I did was to survive it. Now, I see this as an important statement because I don't think people who become enlightened say that. They don't say, it happened and all I did was survive, which makes it sound like a major challenge, right? And the challenging nature of it, I think, is known to some extent. And that's not what we're talking about. And we're not talking about our goal here with this dialogue is enlightenment. I haven't thought about enlightenment in so many years. And I'm not generally thinking about it now. I don't need enlightenment if I can make meaning of anything, right? Like, I guess if it's something that happens, but I'm not really interested in it. But there's still something to be pointed out here. And what I'm going to say is not what Dion Vimal is saying here. It's what I'm saying just from reading this little snippet. And in this case, it's extrapolating it to say, bipolar experiences. And I'm purposefully not saying the word disorder. We're not talking about bipolar disorder. We're talking about, you could call it bipolar awakenings, like Sean Blackwell. And I realize I kind of call it bipolar game changer, right? So the writing the textbook and the studying everything is to become a game changer. At least that could be one learning pathway. And I think that's the pathway I'm writing the textbook of and learning from myself. And it could be that we each need to write our own textbooks and learn from ourselves and carve out our own unique roles. Or there could be a lot of overlap and we can really facilitate each other's exploration and growth. Not from this illness perspective. That is of a different domain. And when that starts to come up, it's important to reach out for help, right? And this is the point here. So Dion Vimal said that enlightenment is something that happened. And now you think about when we were talking about going back to school, but never knowing when it was going to happen. It just might be something that happens. Now, I'm not saying bipolar is enlightenment, though people do feel enlightened as part of it sometimes. And some of that could be related to what is called states versus stages. So one can be in a state of enlightenment or feeling enlightened, but that doesn't mean that we've gotten to the stage of enlightenment. So this bipolar energy is also a happening. And I call it a non-volitional extraordinary state. Non-volitional meaning it's something that happens. It's not something that is willed. It's not something that is chosen. It's not something that is tried to get into. Though, there can be ways to get into a super high state like that if through certain means, right? But overall, it wouldn't be called an organic process if that were the case. So it's something that happened. Again, I'm not saying it's enlightenment per se, but it's a similar thing. And then he goes on to say, the only thing I did was to survive it. And this means that this is also similar in that this awakening, bipolar awakening, is how Sean Blackwell talks about it. He says, oh, you're having a bipolar awakening, is also something that we need to survive. It's hard. It's very challenging. So not only are we going back to school and writing our own textbook and having to learn from that textbook and edit it, we have to physically survive. And now we have to add in like, okay, now you're going to be trained to become, I'll just say, like a deep sea scuba diver, right? Things can happen and it's really challenging. So what I'm trying to say is, if we consider that enlightenment is something that happens and it could be hard to survive, like a challenge, implying that not everybody would survive, bipolar energy is similar, right? Not saying it's the same as an enlightenment that is without the bipolar process, but it's somewhere in that realm. It's some kind of metamorphosis. It's some kind of transformation, right? And the transformation happens by going back to school and writing our own textbook and learning from it. So an awakening is something we have to survive. It's not just like waking up from sleeping in the morning. So an awakening isn't even really the best word for it, because it sounds like such a lovely thing, right? Or such an easy thing. I think before I created a word called quakening. It's probably more like a quakening than an awakening, right? Each time it comes back, it's like, oh, here comes another iteration of the quakening. It's like an earthquake, an inner earthquake. But the thing is, we can learn. So it doesn't say this here. So I'm adding, this is just my own thought, that one of the biggest ways that I feel to survive it is to learn, which is already part of what we've been talking about with writing the textbook and learning from it, and to also be creative and original, right? So I'm learning as I'm talking about this, and that's part of why it's coherent for me, is I'm not just repeating the things I wrote down. I'm basically staring at the same page, and I've been talking for over an hour. I can learn that much from one page when I'm in this state. And I say when I'm in this state because sometimes the insights aren't coming through, and that's fine too. I'm not attached to it either way. I just know how to learn if I'm having insights or if I'm not. And learning is what the brain is designed to do. So the more we are moving in alignment of what the brain is designed to do, the stronger the brain will be. And our brain has to be really strong to get through this. Because the thing is, people with bipolar are told to survive it, right? And this is a little different because I'm seeing something different here now. I'm seeing that bipolar is a happening. It's a non-volitional extraordinary state. And from what Dion Vimal is writing, he's saying, he kind of had to survive the ride. Now, we have to survive the ride in some sense in, say, mania, when there's a lot of energy. One of the ways I do that, the main way, is to make it a sacred process where I mostly stay home and write and learn and extrapolate. It's like a textbook writing time. It's not the time to go out and try to tell people everything about everything. That day may never come. It may. I don't know. So the thing with the bipolar quakening process is that we really do have to study and learn, and what I call harvest, practice, embody. It is more intentional. And part of the reason why could be situational or contextual. So for example, if the non-volitional extraordinary state happened to me and I was in a community or culture that understood that, and they were like bringing me food and keeping me safe and all this for however long it took, whether it was 3 days or 3 months or 3 years, then, maybe I just have to survive it and others are helping me survive it. But in this context where it's turned into illness and, you don't have insight into your illness, like if you have insights, if you have information coming to you that is something other than you're used to, then you have an illness. And if you think your insights are anything meaningful, then you lack insight into your illness. Now, we're not going to go too much into that, except to point out that that's why it needs so much study in this context to overcome the way that the energy is seen. From my research, I haven't seen many people put bipolar in the spectrum of, say, like neurodiversity or seeing differently or human potential or positive psychology. I've actually learned that positive psychology interventions were never designed for people with diagnoses, even though they could have been. So we've never really experienced learning about flow. We could be in a super overflow in mania, but we don't realize that. And if we saw it as a flow state, we might be like, good stuff comes out of flow states. We should work to gather and harvest what is coming through, like through writing the textbook, as we're calling it in this metaphor. So with all of these misunderstandings and putting it into a certain box and not having an information flow between other types of knowledge systems, is so little chance. It's not just something we can just kind of like sit around and float and hope people will bring us food because the community understands, and bring us notebooks to write in and encourage us to stay in and maybe go out just a little and, not get too excited about what's going on out there. Just like if somebody has some kind of extraordinary state experience that they go into willfully through some kind of exogenous substance, they go in a safe container. They don't go parading outside by themselves. That's when things go majorly wrong, right? So imagine one day we get to the understanding where people in society realize that a person is having a quakening and may need help and may need certain things explained to them if they don't already know, or if maybe they knew about it before, because ultimately we all understand that this is a possibility in this fantasy world, but we still need to be reminded about it. I actually had a strange experience about this, and I'm going to share it because it relates. When I was in my first quakening, it went on for 2 months. And at some point, I was going for colon hydrotherapy. And it was starting to really break down and lean more into the scary territory of extra energy states. And the man who was part of the colon hydrotherapy spa, it was basically when you sat there and you didn't need a practitioner, but he would come in and check on you. And he kind of said to me, like, I know what you're going through. And he told me what to do. He motioned, he gestured, he said, like, write things down and then look at it. So he made a motion of writing something down on paper, and then he had the paper in 2 hands, and then he looked at it, like not stared with a focus, but like looked at it like he was taking a picture of the whole thing at once. And he was telling me to do that. And maybe if I just went home and did that for the rest of the time, he's basically saying, write the textbook and look at it. So in the textbook writing state, when there's extra energy, write it down, look at it, maybe read it kind of briefly, but not to extrapolate it, not to study it, not to really start to sort it out. It's the downloading state. If you read about people who write books, they say, well, do a draft, like just write, don't stop writing, and edit it later. It's kind of like that, right? And it really is a state of drafting. And the theme of the first stage of re-uncovery is draft, or the theme is harvest, and the something else is draft. So some people were trying to help me for sure, but I feel like there's not enough context out there where someone would really step in and say a bunch of things. Like, make sure you stay home, show how to write the textbook, and say more things, and then make sure that person is okay. It's not enough. It's not in the awareness at all, right? There's certain other ways that people are trained to deal with it, but I don't want to talk about that stuff. Ideally, one day when there's a sense of that this is important, it's important for human development, for the individual, it's a possible quakening, it's a possible transformation, then maybe others will step in to help to ensure that that transformation is possible. And in saying that, I don't know why I'm sharing these sort of ideal scenarios, but that isn't necessary, because for now what we have is the way that it happens, and that's where we need to start. And that's why re-uncovery is completely self-authored, completely self-determined, completely self-fulfilled. That's how re-uncovery is. I'm not saying that's how all elements of life will be. It's just that's how re-uncovery is designed, because there isn't anything that is saying learn from your experiences. Not that there's nothing, but that's not the message. We're told that it's all nonsense. And 10 years later, it's taken me 10 years to get to the point where I feel like This is not only not nonsense, it's essential. I have known it's essential for me along this way, but I'm starting to see it's essential beyond that. And perhaps one day in the future, my last ideal scenario, it doesn't take that long or that much trouble for a person to get through iterative quakening, and not just get through it, really transform into the deprogrammed version of our being. Okay, so here's the next one. He says, it happened, ... somehow escapes this grip of I. Actually, I want to just say another thing, of course. So we already talked about how it's non-volitional in the quakening. So it's something that happened. And pretty much nobody talks about this with people. Not nobody, but there are people like me talking about it for sure. When I say nobody, I mean the people who get to the level of enlightenment. They don't talk to people who have a diagnosis. They don't talk to them like enlightenment might apply to them. They don't talk to them from the perspective of their journey. There could be some, but for example, even though I've read a lot of Krishnamurti, he didn't talk to people with a diagnosis. He helped, or he spoke to people who probably were tending to be a little better off for the time, right? That was a lot of his audience that would come to see him speak, at least. I don't know. I wasn't there. But it wasn't about talking to people. He wanted basically neurotypical people to see what thought is doing and negate the whole structure of thought and observe without the observer, observe with pure observation, that is choiceless awareness, which generates right action. And he doesn't really say what that looks like. Like, basically, he was trying, to me, it seemed he was trying to get people to that point where they were doing choiceless awareness, perception, right action, and that movement would create a good society. But he wasn't saying, oh, people who have had a crisis, you're transforming, and these are the things that could help, right? So the people that I have studied, they aren't necessarily speaking to people like me. And so the way that Krishnamurti is saying to go about it doesn't even necessarily apply to me, because I'm on a different path now that I've been relegated to this certain category of people, which is good, actually, by the way, because I do like my quakening process. So this is kind of a theme for me, that we haven't really been given much of anything other than, oh, insight into your illness, try to get by, So that's why I feel this is important to give voice to as well. And I wrote down neurotypicals, and then I wrote typical is the ego, the self, the I. So back to this line here. Somehow escapes this grip of I. So this is the third word that kind of captured me to relate to the movement of words and the ego and the self and thought, which is all the same thing. This word grip. And he said, escape the grip of the I. But then it made me realize it's known that often people who have a crisis have experienced trauma. I'm not going to go into details of that, but what I saw was that trauma and all different sorts of thing, whatever it is, again, talking about the quakening process, makes the ego lose its grip. So there's some kind of happening or accumulation of happenings, or, it's probably actually accumulation of thoughts that lead to certain actions that, this isn't a fault thing. It's just there's this accumulation of stress through living in a world of thought. And then eventually that could make the ego lose its grip. In a way, if we go back to how we were saying that the words are fighting, there's a fight within the words, like within the letters, within the whole structure. And the fight is to perhaps maintain the grip, right? It could be that the fight is to maintain the grip, or there's the fighting maintains the grip. So sometimes, in a trauma response, there's fight. So having to fight to actually fight could maybe make the ego lose its grip, like to fight for one's life maybe. And then to have to run could make the ego lose its grip, or to freeze, like to no longer fight, or to fawn. Like these things could possibly make the ego lose its grip, because what I'm seeing is, like in those sorts of scenarios, or just the accumulation of scenarios, we eventually kind of lose our fight, or have to pretend to lose our fight just to change how we are radically in order to continue on, right? Like having to pretend, or like whatever. I don't know. I don't want to go too much into that. I'm just sort of seeing how it could be connected. And they do say in spiritual circles, we have to surrender, right? We have to surrender. So it could be that if something happens that makes us have to surrender, it could lead to a quakening, right? Because things can happen where we have to surrender. Like to some extent, it can be probably a million different things. And we think that we have to surrender. Like that's kind of how it's worded in spirituality. Like we have to surrender. But can the self surrender itself? Can the self render itself obsolete? Like how is that even possible, right? So it makes sense that something just has to happen. Who knows what it is going to be? Something could happen, and it might not even be the thing that happened that happens to create the happening. We don't even know is the thing. And where this is going, that it seems, is that this can happen to anyone. A crisis of this nature can happen to anyone. And I've said this to myself before, I know that. But imagine if we all deeply knew that this could happen to us at any moment. Like how would we want to be received if it happened to us, right? But I guess that doesn't really work, because everyone knows like, oh, this could happen, we could get this illness or that, and like people don't think like that. So that's kind of a dead end, which is fine. But I have a line in my one of my spoken word things that I'm working on that says, anyone with a heart and brain can overnight be diagnosed insane. Something like that. And this next thing, I'll just say it anyway, because I really want to go with what is coming through first and what's on the page second. And what's coming through is that it could be, since things are getting more stressful in the world, there could be a mass happening, a mass quakening. It's possible. So back to the word gripped. So what makes the ego lose its grip? This reminds me of something I wrote in my first book, The Bipolar Game Changer. I wrote about how I was watching a YouTube video about an aircraft accident where the pilot acted in such a way that the plane went beyond the parameters of the autopilot, so it disengaged. So in the same way that, something that goes beyond the parameters of a person's ego, and that would be individual. Like the parameters are similar, but there's nuances and differences, right? Like what bothers me might not bother another person. So going beyond the parameters, which could be stress, like maybe too much stress is definitely one of the things where the ego can lose its grip. We can kind of like lose control of ourselves or lose whatever. It doesn't even have to be psychosis. So we are in the grip of the ego. Like we think, oh, we're living in a prison of the ego, or the prison of thought, or the prison of our mind. But it's actually perhaps a better analogy to say in the grip, right? We even have like the saying, get a grip. So we are gripped, we even know that in a sense. So we're in the grip of the ego, and so we are gripped. What I'm seeing from that image is that, and this is something I'm leaning towards just recently, after watching that video in Sean Blackwell's course, Bipolar Awakenings, he was talking about the lines of development of human consciousness evolution and evolution of society. And that is the work of Ken Wilber. And so now that I'm sort of seeing, and this is also why we need to write our own textbooks and learn from our own textbooks and go from there, is because this part isn't written yet. It's not necessarily that the system and psychiatry is like bad. They just can't see beyond what they're doing. There has to be enough of us writing our textbooks. I'm calling them textbooks, but you know what I mean. And studying and figuring this out. And so why I'm saying this is that rather than thinking the ego is like bad or wrong or whatever it is, what I see with this image is that this grip, if you imagine this grip, which is the ego, around what we are, that grip is a chrysalis, right? The ego is a chrysalis. I haven't seen it like that before. I've often thought about how it's a metamorphosis going through a transformation. And I made the analogy or the illustration in my first book about you can't shove a butterfly back into a chrysalis, but that's kind of what the mental health system tries to do. But if we take this chrysalis and imagine that the ego itself is the shell and it's the chrysalis, I could then sense that each iteration is a crack, right? It's a crack where, say, like one part starts to come out of the chrysalis, this first part, and that's the first extraordinary experience. And then the next part tries to come out, and that's why, it feels different, or it feels like, how am I trying to say this? How this relates now is there's the story that is told about the elephant, and there's people interacting with different parts of the elephant. And one person says the elephant is these sturdy posts. And then someone's like, an elephant is this long thing. And then somebody else is talking about its ears and its body, right? And each person thinks the elephant's something different. So what I mean is each crisis is a different crack, like crack 1, crack 2, crack 3. And then with enough cracks, with the learning that comes with that, then we eventually break out of the chrysalis. So we need a certain number of cracks. So what I'm seeing from that is that to have more episodes, as they call it, is actually a necessary part of it. But the thing that's missing currently is that we're not told to write our textbook and study it and learn each time. The learning is what keeps that part out of the chrysalis. So if we don't learn, it's like shoving that part that came out of the chrysalis of our being, our consciousness, back in, and then sort of gluing it up so it can never pop out again, right? And then in the next crack, if we don't learn, that next part of our consciousness comes out to poke out, like a leg or whatever. It's not a leg, it's consciousness. But then the part from iteration 1 tries to come out too. It's like, you didn't learn this lesson. I'm coming out too. And then it seems worse, right? And then it gets pushed in again with like more of what they do, and then glued up again. And then it happens again. And there's no learning, there's no textbook, there's no re-uncovery, there's no re-encoding, there's no integration. And so it tries to come out again, like the third part of consciousness plus as much that can reach. And it's all distorted because it's reaching out this third crack when it was supposed to come out that next crack. And, it's getting all crowded in there. And it's like, how is it going to break open the chrysalis? And then it gets pushed in again, So I'm sort of seeing it like that it is we are in an ego chrysalis, and then each iteration is an opportunity to learn, right? And so like the thing too is, if I learn from my first textbook, and I won't even say first textbook because it's, as things are now, it's like impossible, not impossible. I still have what I wrote down from my very first mania. I've never looked at it and really gone into it because it wasn't as coherent as what came through later. So I just went into that, and there was too much to do all of it. So anyways, if I do learn from the first one or the second one, then that part of my consciousness informs the next thing to come out of the crack, the next part of consciousness to come out of the crack next time. And so it comes out stronger and easier and like faster, faster not in terms of like faster in mania, but just the whole process is a lot smoother because the consciousness is total. It's the whole elephant. It's not just like the elephant is a leg. So the first time it comes through, there's some leg that's disconnected from everything. No, it's connected. So the learning comes through for the next crack in the consciousness. And eventually, when the cracks happen, it's very, very smooth and easy. And, I would like to say then eventually just bust out of the chrysalis, but it might not even be like that. It could be poking holes in the chrysalis for like a really long time. And I say that because I'm assuming that if consciousness comes out as like a butterfly, no, I'm not any kind of butterfly consciousness, so I can't go that far, but doesn't mean it's not worth sharing from where I'm at now. And like I said, I've been working on all of this stuff for like 10 years, so that's longer than I went to university. So hopefully I have something to share about it. So all of this so far is at the level of sort of linguistics and semantics, like the semantics of the self, but not even that, the energy behind the semantics, the gripping nature of it, the fighting, the walking away, the turning away. So there's, within the nature of how we use language now, or how language uses us, there's a turning away, there's a fighting, there's a gripping. Like these are all like these forces within language. So I'm not sure if anyone has really said anything like that before, because we think of just like words on a page, right? The letter on the page, which is space, the time it takes to write, and then the meaning, the semantics. But I don't think there's part of linguistics that's talking about the forces within the words themselves, because generally people who are linguists are people who operate primarily with thought and knowledge, right? So then when we look at it from the perspective of insight, we can start to see the forces. So there is something in language called illocutionary acts. Like they understand language can do something. Like to sign your name is not just writing your name. There's more like meaning behind that. So there's kind of that illocutionary force that is doing some kind of action. Or like saying thank you, right? That's an action in language. Whereas shaking someone's hand is an action in physical, right? But then this is a bit different because it's like the forces in language when it's used through thought, and then perhaps we haven't gotten to, and I don't know if and when we will, the forces or the space in language that is used or utilized by insight. And again, if we think about an action within insight, creating a thought is just one of the bits of it. It's not the only function of insight. Insight has a lot more functions than that. For example, I can have an insight and it might make me do a certain action that is not writing it down, and I never write it down. So writing an insight out as an apparent thought, it's not even a thought, right? So it's an insight, so even the written thought that might be seen as a written thought, the written insight has different forces within it. It has a different geometry. So there could be a geometry behind the words and the language that leads them to fight, to walk away, and to be gripped. And it's very hard to share what I mean by all that, but hopefully I made it somewhat clear. It's kind of like they have a certain gravity, right? So we need a word for that. So I just paused to look up a word. I was looking up synonyms for letter and also for force. So kind of like the force of the letters. Sometimes I can just come up with a word, but a synonym for letter that was there was grapheme. I don't know if that's the right one to go with, but the word I created is graphemetrics, sort of like the geometry of what we're talking about here. And there's likely more forces in there than grip and fight. There could be as many forces as there are verbs, right? The verbs might be from this perspective of thoughts that are looping, taking the wrong turn, creating the self. And what I'm seeing and why I'm saying that is, if we had a different perspective, in my spoken word I say, points out the pointless, infinite points perspective. Points out pointless, infinite points perspective. Something like that. That infinite points perspective, that decentralization of vision, where we're not looking through focal vision of what thought is saying, which creates a veil, right? That's useful as well. Like I said, with the Chrysalis example is, that's a stage of development. It's not bad. And each time part of consciousness comes out of the chrysalis, it's seeing through what I call this aperture mode, where in mania, pupils literally widen. Like we literally have a bigger aperture. We're taking in more information. There's more light hitting our retina. What do you think's going to happen? It gives us more energy. We're sped up. We're trying to respond to that much more energy. So what I'm saying is the aperture perspective, which is one mode, is different than the focus perspective. And the focus perspective itself, the I, the self, the ego, might have a set of verbs, of actions, of illocutionary actions, as well as the verbs that are common of the things that we do, the things that we do as the self perspective. We do, we have, we love, we this, we that. Well, the aperture perspective might have some of the same verbs and a lot of different ones. So the verbs themselves might have come out of the self, right? Which makes sense because we do everything pretty much consciously that we do in language, as part of language that is with thought. And so thought created those verbs and those doings, and thought created the things and the technologies that we do what we do, Swiping. Thought created that technology of the phones that created that we swipe in that new way. So aperture consciousness has different verbs, different language. So it makes sense that when somebody goes into aperture consciousness in an extraordinary state, they're making up new words, right? They're trying to find the words for what they see. And, I just made up a new word. When I said that, I realized that we're actually neologism-ing. And I, for some reason, feel like we're probably prisming. So in a way, we think of neologisms, but there's also two neologism. Well, you can say to coin as well, right? To coin. But when you add to neologism, it almost gives it a feeling of something that's valid, right? Versus neologisms, like, oh, over here, these bad made up words. So there's a certain linguistics of the self perspective, which is the ego chrysalis. So we're in a chrysalis of language, right? We can say, oh, the ego is a chrysalis, but if we break that down further, the ego is a chrysalis of language, the chrysalis is language, but it's not language per se, it's the structure of it, right? It's actually seemingly enforced by graphemetrics, or graphemetric forces, I'll just call it that. So this structure of language creates the chrysalis, creates the ego, I mean. So there's a structure of language that creates the ego. Now, the funny thing about this metaphor, or this illustration here, is that, like, we can think of the ego as one thought at a time, just for simplicity's sake. And a thought is a sentence, like I, subject, verb, object, right? So it's just subject, verb, object that are in the way, that it's the veil, right? That's what's in the way. It's not like some big chrysalis egg thing around us. It's literally subject, verb, object. This geometry that is in the way, and one after the other. So it's like, imagine like how to blind a human being. Just put subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object in their eyes, in their mind's eye, in their brain, and then they can't see. Like, that's kind of the game. And so what is subject, verb, object? It is the structure and the process of knowledge, or of knowledge and knowing, right? Knowing something. So in a way, not knowing, they say not knowing, but in a way, knowing is a knot that we tie ourselves up in. So that's part of the self. I don't know if it is the self, but the self isn't real. It's like knowledge tying itself in knots through the knower. The knower is like the needle, and the rest, like the eye, is the needle. And then that's like pulling the string of knowledge, and that creates this chrysalis. So it could actually be kind of a woven chrysalis, like all these weaves of knowledge, right? And then we have these associations in our mind, and there's this knot of knowledge, and we have these associations, and then that's kind of how the thinking process happens. For the most part, just generalizing, it's this process of association, like loose association of knowledge and memories. But there's actually no knower or no thinker there, because we think there's a knower, but it's sort of an algorithm, right? It's actually just an algorithm of this subject, verb, object, and then associating to some other subject, verb, object. And it's an algorithm that, I remember I read this book, Algorithms to Live By, and I'm pretty sure one of the chapters was on the optimal stopping problem. And so this subject, verb, object, association after another, creating a sense of I, like an I that knows something and is experiencing something, has no stop, right? It has no stop. And so thought and knowledge aren't necessarily a problem. It's just that it doesn't stop. Now I'm speaking generally because Krishnamurti speaks generally about thought. That's not the reason, but there's more research now on how a lot of people have aphantasia. A lot of people don't hear an inner voice. A lot of people hear an inner voice, and there's so many different variations that it hasn't been a part of the conversation where we're like, this is how I process information inside of me, right? So it could be that a lot of people don't necessarily have this subject, verb, object, overt inner voice, thinking in inner sound thing. There can be images, I don't know. Just talking about, in general, there's a veil that is created by the movement of knowledge that is part of memory, which limits the amount of information we can take in, which is a good thing in many ways. But then because we're limited, we always are seeking something more, but that something more is having access to more information than what the thought system of operation, whatever that looks like, allows us to have. Now we can even imagine that, say, people with HSP, like highly sensitive personhood, maybe they have more aperture and they do have more information, and then they have to adjust their lives accordingly, and they don't really have subject, verb, object happening. I'm not trying to make any assumptions. We're just kind of brainstorming. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through the rest of what came through this morning. If I set the intention to talk about what is most alive, or at least most recent. This next part is related to the last part, and I remember writing it out fast, so maybe I'll just read through all of it. It's just 4 sticky notes. The ego is a linguistic grip. It has us in its grip, and it's gripping to us. But it's not the words themselves, it's the structure, direction, etc., that creates the grip, the conflict. Words in conflict with themselves. Not the self observed. The self is not real, but the words are. So the way the words move, their shape creates the conflict, and thus self that is separate and in conflict with its environment. But it's not in conflict. The conflict is that the being doesn't see, and the being doesn't see because of the structure the words have taken to create a perspective. What I see from that right now is like the words, the structure of the words creates a filter. So I was calling it a veil, but it's kind of like a camera filter. And I was thinking about this before when we were talking about the aperture, the eye with a larger pupil, and then the focal vision. So the focal vision is like ego thought, and the aperture vision is like insight. I call it see-go, because you see and then you go, or you see and then you have an insight. But it seems like the evolution is like we're learning photography. It's like we're learning filmography with our eye, right? Like we've gotten to a certain point, and then now we got to figure out how to use our eyes differently. It's like the evolution of the eye is central. This is reminding me of a movie I watched years ago called Eye Origins, and the guy was studying the evolution of the eye and the human eye. I won't say anything about the movie. It's actually really good, but I think he was thinking it was very central, like the way it evolved. And so I'm feeling like if I wanted to get, so for these sticky notes, some of the points might be a step back from what we talked about, because I didn't even know that I wrote more about it over here. But the idea that the ego is gripping to us, right? We're gripped by ourselves. It's gripping. Well, sometimes it can get boring, but we're still gripped by it, even if it's boring. So I did go into the structure and the direction that creates the grip, but it seems like it creates a filter. What I'm sort of seeing or feeling is how, like if you have a polarized lens and you turn it one way, the light goes in somehow and then the other way, but it's like we have the aperture can get bigger or smaller, but we can turn the filter up or down. or we can put a filter on and take it off, right? So like right now, it's almost like if our eye was a camera, we're able to focus in on something, right? In detail. And then if we have the aperture mode, we can like let in more light. But then we also have this filter that grips on, that is the ego, right? So even if more light comes in when there's that ego filter on, then it's just going to make more of that. And what this could relate to is, the realization that some kind of spirituality working towards minimizing the ego can actually make these aperture states of extraordinary experience maybe slightly easier over time. But again, we're not taught that. Like I read The Power of Now years ago and I found that helpful to a certain extent. But more light going through the ego filter is not necessarily good, because it just sees more of what the ego wants to see. And that could be part of the challenge. I don't know. I'm not going to go deeply into that, but I think it's helpful at this moment to see that there's aperture mode, there's focus mode, but there's also this filter that's gripped on. And if we get aperture when the filter is gripped on, then that creates a lot more like ego self challenges. But the way I've seen it in my experience is that if the aperture consciousness happens and there's more information coming in and there's the ego filter, like some good stuff gets in because there's an intensity. But if the ego becomes augmented, like say in the case of like the extreme case of like grandiosity, it's extreme because it's intense, but it is also common, is part of it is to see clearly what the ego is doing, right? So if it's really, really amplified, there's a higher chance to see what it's doing, or, somebody else sees what it's doing and whatever happens. But yeah, that goes along with how I've thought about it before. So I'll read these ones here too and see if any extrapolation comes up. These ones seem kind of like spiritually, but I'll read them anyway. And they were sparked by the word happening or happen from what I read before. The happening of awakening is of the nature of the totality of choiceless awareness, of the ground of consciousness. Did this happening happen to the happenstance you call you? A happening has already happened to the diagnosed, non-volitional, extraordinary experiencers. How to survive this transformation, the journey back to the natural creative state. That's why creativity is important. We must create our way out of it, not only heal in order to transform. Healing without learning may lead to being left with a dullness that attracts drama. This happened to me. When we start to see thought just happens, there is no self that thinks thoughts. That thought happens one after the other, and the sense we are thinking them is the grip, is what grips us. So the feeling like they're my thoughts is what grips us. That creates my identity, my this. And when we begin to see that there is no thinker, there's only thought, it creates space. And that space is what may allow a crack in the chrysalis to see something new. We are afraid of silence, emptiness, nothingness, because the self associates that with death. And the self is right. What is silence, is the death of the ego, not the body. So we need to decentralize and decouple the ego and have it as an app, not the dashboard and user. The self, thought, images, imagines itself to be two things, the user and the dashboard. It doesn't see it's meant to now decentralize and be an app. It opens for a very specific situation or function. Functions designated by the language structure of thought. Humanity has many more functions, but we need the language to bring them about. We think we learn from stories and live in a story because the ego tells tales all day long. Life isn't a story. That is a lullaby that prevents the learning required to survive quakening. The self looks for happiness. Pure observation and perception sees meaning, because meaning is everywhere. Meaning is, and what is what is means in the moment. Thanks for listening to today's insights. I hope you saw something new.